this morning. It's my great pleasure to be here. Before I start, I just wanted to thank Devin Belcher and Amanda Woolley for organizing the symposium. You've done a wonderful job, beautiful program. Thank you. And if you get a chance to stop and to take a look at the art, which is in the 24-hour room on your way out. So, I've come this morning to talk a little bit about a subject that I taught at Oglethorpe this spring in the adult program. I had a wonderful class, and every time I teach a class, I learn something about the subject, which I think is why we teach. Sometimes I wonder what else there is to say about the Holocaust. We've got tens of thousands of books, memoirs, oral and written, from both victims and perpetrators, diaries, novels, reams of documents from dozens of countries, court transcripts by the millions, films, documentary films, popular films that depict one part of the event or another. So at the same time, it's so overwhelming, so saturated. Right? How many of you have familiar with Anne Frank? Raise your hand. Night. So most of these are staples in middle school or high school. Right. Those look familiar to you. Schindler's List, Boy in the Striped Pajamas. I used to work with middle and high school teachers on trying to help them draw lessons from the Holocaust. And I realized how difficult it is when talking to an 8th grade teacher trying to talk about Anne Frank to make some meaning of the story. Right? What do 8th graders get? Yes, it's sad that Anne Frank had to be locked up in an attic with her family, that she was deprived any sense of normal childhood, that her family was denounced and she died a horrible death. That they get. But one can't get from her diary that Anne was just one small piece in the Nazi plan, and that she and her family were perceived as mortal threats to the world by the Nazis and their allies. Which is so interesting. I mean, you look at Anne Frank, how much of a threat can she be? So after teaching classes on the Holocaust over years, I will generalize, but most students come in wanting to learn about a couple of things. They want to learn about Adolf Hitler, because he's so omnipresent in popular culture. Used to, a few years ago, they ran an analysis of the covers of the National Enquirer, and Hitler was just 2 covers ahead of Elvis, who had more on the cover of the National Enquirer. Because of his strangeness, because of his maniacal personality, students want to ask, how could Hitler have done this? How did he brainwash all those people to follow him blindly? Or students might want to know how a country that was supposedly decimated after World War I in 1918 could hold the world at bay just 20 years later. They lost the war, they lost millions of people, they had to pay millions in reparations, they lost territory, and yet 20 years later, they almost win another World War. How is that possible? Or maybe it's odd that the nation which produced the most Nobel Prize winners and had the best educated people in the world would support a fascist government. But today I'm going to talk about none of those things. What I want to do is move, there he is. What I want to do is move the center away from Hitler, not because I disagree that he was a bit odd and loathsome, he was in spades, but because understanding Hitler does not always help us comprehend the horrors of the Holocaust. It's comforting to blame the Holocaust on Hitler, or Hitler and his inner circle, as many did after 1945, because by doing so, it absolves others of their guilt and obscures the universality of the lessons. Ordinary Germans can blame Hitler, so it was not their fault. Other nations can blame Hitler, so they don't have to look too closely at their own behavior. And even those who committed acts of violence themselves can simply reply, I was just following orders. So it should be pointed out that while there are many facets of the Holocaust that make it unique, what to me makes it most important to study is it is like other incidents of genocide and mass killing perpetrated by ordinary people, people like you and me. Abraham Lincoln said in his famous debate with Stephen Douglas in Illinois that Southerners are just what we would be in their situation. And he emphasized that people get used to the arrangements around them. Of course, he was talking about slavery, but I think the same could be said about the Nazis. So here are some points that I want to emphasize today, just a couple. One is about numbers, right? The magnitude of this. So if one figures that the Holocaust lasted about 2,000 days, more or less, and about 6 million Jewish people were murdered, that computes to about 3,000 people each and every day. And I use this figure because I don't know how to explain 6 million. I don't know what 6 million anything looks like. I'm sure I know what 3,000, but that's more understandable to me and I think to students. And so what does 3,000 mean? Well, we lost almost 3,000 people on 9/11. So those of you, and it's harder to, when you talk to traditional age students, to relate to 9/11. But if you remember, it was of course a horribly tragic day for this country. A day that we still live with the consequences. Right? And 3,000 Americans were needlessly murdered. But imagine that every single day for 2,000 days. Right? And instead of a population of 300 million, which was the United States, we're dealing with a population of about 10 to 11 million. So I use these figures because I think that it's important to understand that the magnitude of this didn't just happen by accident, and it didn't just happen with one person. How many people does it take to kill millions over 5.5 years? Millions who had to be transported hundreds, sometimes 1,000 miles to be killed in a particular manner for a specific purpose. And why did they do it? If Hitler himself, of course, didn't kill these folks, and while we can debate the centrality of his plan, the killing of his victims of the Holocaust, by and large, were carried out by normal individuals like you and me. Second point, and my classes know that I say this all the time, not all Germans were Nazis, and not all Nazis were German. It's tempting to equate Nazis with Germans, but it's unfair. While Hitler, of course, was the leader of Germany, although he himself wasn't German, and the Nazis were undeniably popular in Germany in 1939, there were many Germans who abhorred the Nazis and went to great lengths to help victims. Likewise, there were many non-Germans who behaved more like Nazis than the Germans. Europe in 1940 was filled with what I would call little Hitlers. Just wanted to bring this up. How many of you have been to this or know about this project? I have not been there, but it is in Chattanooga, so 2 hours away. This was a project done by a Chattanooga teacher in middle school when she had trouble describing what 6 million meant, and so the best way that she could do it was to collect 6 million paper clips. And this led to a museum outside of their middle school, just north of Chattanooga, which has a railroad car from the 1940s with the paper clips, and then a description of the project about how this took place, which I think is really neat. Romanian Jews didn't fare too well. Ionescu, the Romanian Iron Guard, very similar to Hitler. Very few people know a lot about these people. Miklos Horthy, Hungarian leader, friends with Hitler. Father Joseph Tiso, Slovakian leader. I show these pictures to show you that it wasn't just Hitler, that this stuff couldn't happen without the cooperation of Hitler's allies, both in country form and individually. 3, no one was brainwashed. Right? It's comforting to think that either Hitler did it all, that the killers were all German, or that people were somehow not acting with their own choice. People responsible for the killing grew up with relatively good education, not under any dictatorship. Remember, most of the people who were killing in the 1940s were educated in the 1920s where there were no Nazis, or even in the early 1930s until the curriculums have been changed. More than 20 years ago, Christopher Browning, historian now at the University of North Carolina, published a book entitled Ordinary Men. It examined a reserve battalion of about 5 to 600 middle-aged males who worked normal jobs, but on weekends for a couple of weeks at a time, were sent to Poland and were responsible for about the deaths of 80,000 Jews, whose only crime was that they were Jewish. And again, the magnitude of this, 80,000 people killed just by this one battalion. Fewer than 15 of the 500 to 600 men opted out of this duty, even when opting out was possible. We also want to believe that people had to kill or they themselves would be killed, but there's very little evidence of that. Browning found that peer pressure and obedience to authority were the greatest contributing factors. His point, much like Stanley Milgram decades before Browning, was that it does not take much to prompt individuals to commit acts of violence. 4, ordinary people committed heinous crimes. The killing was rationalized in many different ways, and I'm not going to talk so much about that, but let me just give you a couple of examples of people who were ordinary that we know a little bit about. The first is a guy named John Demjanjuk. Many of you may remember John Demjanjuk, if you're old enough, because he was quite a celebrity for a while back in the 80s and then in the 90s as he went through 2 very public trials, one in Cleveland and one in Jerusalem. So here's what we know about Demjanjuk. As far as we know, he was a poor Ukrainian, came from a farming family, and joined with the Nazis because it was a chance to fight against Stalin, who was guilty of subjecting Ukraine and Ukrainians to grotesque violence. That killing Jews was seen as justifiable for the Demjanjuks and many people like him for a combination of religious and economic reasons, that is, they profited from this, and that it was a chance for Demjanjuk to fight for an independent Ukraine, which he hoped would be established after the war. So Demjanjuk and many, many like him were cheap and willing labor that were, I don't want to say pleased, but willing to act in brutal ways toward Jews and Russians. They were not forced to do it, but found in the Nazis a cause that they could identify, and the blame was deflected from them and absolved by higher authorities, including many of their religious leaders. They did not know, or perhaps could not imagine, that the Nazis would kill Ukrainians soon after having them kill Jews. Many rationalized their brutality under the guise of fighting for national honor, which, as we know, can justify mass murder in other circumstances too. So here's the interesting thing about Demjanjuk. After the war, he lived for 25 years in Cleveland as an auto worker for Ford. He was a pillar of the church, staple of the community. He was known for fixing kids' bicycles. Right? So kids in the neighborhood would take their bikes to Uncle John, who would, for free, fix the chains and do the brakes and so on and so forth. From all accounts, from his family, from his friends, he was a generous and loving soul. So how was it possible that for a time in his life he worked at death camps where he brutally beat prisoners to death? How could people do that at one stage and then in the next stage be church-going, bicycle-fixing, wonderful men like John Demjanjuk? One could say, what choice did Demjanjuk and others have because it was war? Maybe he was forced to do it with a gun to his head. But examples abound in what was Eastern Poland during the Holocaust. Some Polish people, not all Polish people certainly, but some Polish people participated in mass killing without any prompting by Germans. This is uncomfortable to think about. Holocaust victims included not just those murdered at Auschwitz or Treblinka, but also those killed in their own homes and towns. And this included people who were killed not only from 1941 to 1945, the killing years of the Holocaust, but also even after the Nazis had been expelled from Poland. Even after the war, right, hundreds of Jews were killed in Poland after Hitler was dead. About a decade ago, a historian named Jan Gross wrote a book called Neighbors, where he detailed what occurred in one small town in Zimbabwe on one day in July of 1941. Right, so this takes the magnitude of 6 million in 5 years down to one day. Whereas he writes, one half of the town murdered the other half, not because they had to, but because they derived some benefit from it. Right, so this was a town of about 3,000 people, a very small, sleepy town, nondescript in any way, shape, or form. About half of the inhabitants were Jewish, half were Catholic Poles, and just on one day, and without prompting, without orders by the Nazis, the the town's Catholics turned on the town's Jews. Gross and many others point to ordinary greed, and we know that turning Jews into authorities could be profitable, and once gone, their property was expropriated and pillaged. So one of the points I try to emphasize is how large the Holocaust was, which included the planning by top Nazis that people have heard about, like Heinrich Himmler, Reinhard Heydrich, Adolf Eichmann. But it also took the cooperation of train drivers, chemists, architects, teachers, nurses, clergy, doctors, none of whom had to do it, most of whom derived some benefit from it. It also encompassed ordinary people who in no way would have been part of mass murder had they not been given the opportunity. For some in Zimbabwe, they were driven by irrational hatred of Judaism, a few, but most others by greed. In a recent book by Mary Fulbrook, called A Small Town Near Auschwitz, the author looks at a man named Udo Clausa, who looked over the deportation of 22,000 Jews, a small percentage of course, 6 million, but as we try to look at local examples. Yet he was a nice, smart man, much like Demjanjuk. He was convinced he was not a real Nazi because, quote, he never participated in violent actions. That is, he never beat anyone to death, he never threw anybody into the gas chamber, never shot anybody in the head, but yet he supervised their deportation and in some ways could rationalize that. A man named Oscar Groening was recently featured in a New Yorker piece. It appears that he counted the valuables that victims sacrificed upon entering Auschwitz. He watched mass murder for over a year, profited from it himself, but absolves himself of any guilt by blaming the killing on others. Wendy Lauer wrote a recent book on German women in the Nazi killing field, suggesting that women were no better than men in their behavior, and that almost all escaped punishment after the war, most of whom lived fulfilling lives you would never guess that they were killers, all rationalized their behavior in one way, shape, or form. So that's the bad stuff. Let me also talk about how ordinary people can become heroic. Some individuals who were not very exceptional in any other circumstance acted heroically during the Holocaust. In a small town, not so different than Zimbabwe in Poland, we find Chambon, where very ordinary farmers were inspired to risk their own lives to save what amounted to thousands of Jewish strangers, so that these strangers would not be deported by the French government and sent to the camps in the East. This case, which was told so well in the documentary Weapons of the Spirit, it's wonderful because it seems so black and white to these townsmen. These folks asked for nothing in return, a la the Good Samaritan. That they did what was right, not because of any profit from it, or not because of any connection to the individuals that they were helping, but because that is their read of the Bible, that one helps the stranger. What's so distressing about this town is that there are so few examples like it. So if they could do it, why couldn't others? I'll get to them in just a minute. In a recent Polish film called In Darkness, there's a story that centers on a man named Leopold Socha. We'll get to that in a minute. In Le Chambon, pastor and his wife, Andre and Magda Chokme, were the inspirations behind why these ordinary French farmers saved Jews who they didn't know. Right? And one of the reasons that we think, after talking to the villagers, is that these two people, especially Andre, from his pulpit, kept linking good behavior with what they were doing. In other words, what they were doing is what Jesus would have wanted them to do. Which is so interesting because in Poland and in other places, we see people rationalizing sending people to their death because that's what Jesus would have wanted people to do. So Socha in In Darkness, this was a recent film about the city of Lvov in eastern Poland. He's an ordinary civil servant whose job it is to clean the sewers in the town. He is uneducated and poor. He ends up hiding 24 Jewish people in the sewers. They survive for years in darkness, literally and figuratively. Socio is an interesting person. At first, he was motivated by the money that the poor victims were paying him. He would only hide them as long as they paid him. Like many at the time, he believed that the Jews had killed Christ. He repeats this to his wife, and he repeats to his wife the ominous verse in the Gospel of Matthew about the blood being on the Jews and their children. His wife corrects his biblical interpretation that she too, although is okay with saving Jews, but it becomes increasingly clear that what her husband is doing may cause danger to the family, and there she's a little reticent to do that. In the end, he convinces her that that's the right thing to do. Right? When the money runs out, he continues to save them, because in the time he was saving them, he got to know them, and it appears he turned from somebody who was just doing this for greed to somebody who was doing this because it was the right thing to do. He metamorphosizes into the hero. Interestingly enough, though, after the war, he's denounced for hiding the Jews, again, after the war. In a narrative told at the New Holocaust Museum outside of Chicago, in Skokie, a man named Aaron Elster tells his story about being hidden by a farmer in Poland who was filled with nothing but hostility toward Aaron and his sister. For 2 years, a 12-year-old and 11-year-old lived in a barn, fed by these owners who risked their lives to do that. Had these people been discovered, the farmers clearly would have been in trouble. But each day, the farmer and his wife cursed at he and his sister for causing the war and for being Jews. But in the end, they persevered in saving their lives. It's not always easy. Heroes and villains are not always easy to separate. So how does one view these farmers who, after the war, were forced to flee their town because it was discovered that they had helped the Jews survive? Raoul Wallenberg, who many of you may recognize. Raoul Wallenberg is probably the most well-known, maybe outside of Oskar Schindler, for helping Jews. It is the street that the Holocaust Museum in Washington is named. What used to be 15th Street is now Raoul Wallenberg Drive. So Raoul Wallenberg took it upon himself from his post in Budapest in Hungary in 1944 to concoct fake passports for Jews so that they would be diplomatically shielded from deportation to Auschwitz, which would have meant sure death. Wallenberg risked his own life, his staff risked their lives. They profited not at all, and like so many others, unfortunately, this doesn't have a happy ending because Raoul Wallenberg was arrested after the war, taken to the Soviet Union where he died in a gulag. Just 2 other points and I will conclude. Aaron Elster, there he is, recounts his mother before his mother died and before he was being sheltered by these farmers, recalled his mother smothering her baby, Aaron's sister, so that she would not make a sound and give away a hiding place to the Nazis. The same theme reoccurs in so many Holocaust memoirs that ordinary people have to make extraordinary decisions. Students can sometimes then make the connection that the Holocaust threw morality up in the air so that killing one's children became not only moral, but maybe even heroic, whereas keeping them alive might doom the family and others. So to talk about that, for me, is more complicated and disturbing than the focus on Hitler. Last slide. Probably looked like Peter Coward for a minute. This is Hiram Kowski. Again, this is complicated. Ordinary insurance peddler who became head of the Lodz ghetto. Remember many conversations with another faculty member that I co-taught with, who was always unwilling to hold any Jewish official accountable for bad conduct, arguing that they didn't ask for what they received. And I agree in part that the share of culpability of Bukowski shouldn't be overestimated. But again, ordinary folks were thrown into untenable positions. Some, in retrospect, acted well, others did not, and it's really difficult to judge. He accepted the position of ghetto leader, which placed him in charge, nominally, of about 250,000 Jews. Think of that, 250,000 people living in this ghetto. It's a city, it's not a ghetto. They were all living in squalor. They lived there for years. Bukowski had to divide resources that the Nazis would allow him, so the Nazis gave him X number of calories of food, some money, some jobs. He needed to divide up who lived and who died. Now, he could have said, I don't want to do this job. He could have done it differently. But in the end, it turns out he favored members of his own inner circle, those who could pay. And it's very difficult now to judge people like Bukowski, who did things that I would hope maybe I would not have done, but who could say if put in this kind of untenable position. Right. I could go on with thousands of other examples, but I'll conclude just with this. What makes the Holocaust frightening and also fascinating to me is not Hitler or Himmler, but John Demjanjuk and Andrei Trocmé. Demjanjuk serves as a microcosm of the tens of thousands who committed violent actions, theft, or who prospered from the demise of Holocaust victims. One did not have to physically act violently, as Demjanjuk did, but inventing chemicals like Zyklon B, performing medical experiments on healthy people, as the Nazi doctors and nurses did, or informing authorities of the whereabouts of Jews, made the Holocaust possible and terrible. I would just surmise if Oglethorpe University gave $1,000 to turn in neighbors for bad behavior, would you do it? For some in World War II, 1 kilo of sugar was worth the same. Some people were poor and justified bad actions out of necessity. Others did because they honestly felt that the world would be a better place without Jews. The power of authority. In Zimbabwe, citizens were moved to attack Jews and burn them in a barn because the mayor sanctioned it. As Milgram and others have shown, when those in charge give license to violence and absolve others of responsibility, human beings more often than not can behave violently. Christianity. This one becomes a little touchier, because while not all Christians were Nazis, all Nazis were raised in a Christian household. And many had stereotypes of Jews confirmed in churches. As Socha says quizzically to his wife, well, they did kill Jesus. So at the same time that the Catholic Church sanctioned genocidal violence in Croatia, others used the church and the teachings of the Gospels to affect their actions for the good. And it's ironic that while the Nazis tried to embrace Jesus as their own, even Aryanized Jesus, of course Jesus himself, Joseph, Paul, Peter, Mary, Peter, Paul, and Mary, the whole gang would have been on trains to Treblinka or Auschwitz. Lastly, ordinary people can make a difference. From Raoul Wallenberg to Oskar Schindler to unnamed farmers with previous little distinction, rose up to do the right thing, while at the same time equal nondescript folks chose to capitalize on conditions and take advantage for themselves. Why did some act one way and others act differently? In 2 weeks, it'll be Yom HaShoah Day, where those who choose will honor the victims of the Holocaust. I would like to think we've learned from this, and it'll never happen again, and I would be wrong. So the best we can do is be cognizant of the systems that we put in place, the kind of education we expose our children to, and the value we place on differences. Thank you. question was that people who acted in some ways heroically and nobly to shelter those had a personal relationship. I think there's some evidence to suggest that. But what is confounding to that is, for instance, in towns like Zimbabwe, these were people who had been living together for hundreds of years. They knew each other by name, they shopped in each other's stores, and just one day, not coming to the town, their army was not there, there was just a couple of officials. Before the Nazis had been moved in, the Polish mayor got the town leaders together and either, you could say, either mass hysteria ensued or a calculated effort to get rid of half the town's inhabitants. Who they do? Yes?
Has anybody heard of any research that tried to search around problem?
So the question about Hannah Arendt, who was a philosopher and journalist who's best known for covering the Enlightenment trial in Jerusalem in 1960 and 61, had this phrase about the banality of evil. So I can refer to my colleagues in philosophy more about Hannah Arendt and the banality of evil. I think it kind of depends. What she said is looking at a guy like I who looked so ordinary and yet did all of these extraordinary things. And I think there is something to that most of the people that acted one way or the other weren't necessarily, they were not famous people, they were not charismatic people, they were just people doing their jobs, either for the good or for the bad. Now, I think we can quibble over the word banality and, if somebody commits acts of mass violence, it's that. But I think that her work on evil started more work on evil. As one learns more of the stories, I think it's up to the philosophers and the historians and the people studying literature to put labels on what you see. Yes, Jay?
There's also the question of collective memory and guilt. I was living in France in the 1970s, and really France had refused to or could not cope with the collective memory of, or there was this notion that everyone had been, of course, at the time of liberation, of course, everybody was resistant, nobody was a collaborator. It was Louis Malle that went back to his memories, and I remember that the first film that came out that talked about this was La Convention, that told you a story about he's just a kid you could relate with, who just became a collaborator, a Nazi, and beat up people. And I remember, and it started a flood of films you mentioned just how much scholarship there is there now.
Including Louis Malle's own film.
Louis Malle's film. So now there's just all sorts of films, there's more films than you can deal with. But I remember in the 1970s when I went to see film, it went off the screens pretty quickly. Nobody really wanted to see it, and I had to find one movie house in one neighborhood where I could go to see it.
So collective memory is really important. It's something I'm really interested in. I would say the same about Poland. There's a national memory based on sometimes a national myth. And I think in the United States, all countries have this.
Sure.
We want to construct a narrative of what we think our country is based on the story that we think our country had. And the story in France and in Poland, very similarly, is that we were victims. The whole country were victims, and therefore everybody in the country were victims. But parsing out, because it's hard in the 1970s for French kids to go home and ask their grandfather or their grandmother, what did you do during the war? And the answer is usually, well, I was with the resistance, so I prefer not to talk about it. Not that I worked with Nazis, but it was really complicated, you have to understand. And so collectively, France and Poland and Hungary have issues, because the textbooks afterwards want to portray they, individually and collectively, as victims, but in fact, it's much more complicated than that. Yes?
I was wondering if you know any good comparative studies about collective memory.
very simple. All right, well, thank you so much for your